So we're getting a Red Goblin Carnage symbiote in this story, and it's amazing. So this is the official start of Carnage Reigns. This is the crossover event between Miles Morales Spider-Man and Carnage, or at least Cletus Kasady. Remember, the main Carnage symbiote is out there in space, achieving insane levels of power and basically becoming God. That's going to go into the War of the Symbiotes this summer, so don't forget about that. But the thing about this is this initially opens up with Miles Morales recalling his last experience with the Carnage symbiote, because it's not the first time they've met. A lot of people in the comments didn't realize that, but remember, during the events of King in Black, Absolute Carnage, all that kind of stuff, Miles Morales became a Grendel. He became part of the Carnage symbiote at one point in time, and in fact, he attacked Venom during that story. So lest we forget, Miles has met Carnage before. But the thing about this is that it terrifies him, because remember, the big difference between Venom and Carnage is Venom is just like a symbiote that was once bonded to Spider-Man. Spider-Man got rid of it in the old Web of Spider-Man stories, and Venom's hated him ever since. Carnage is an answer to the question, what happens if the Joker becomes Venom? It's just this unbridled, pure, unadulterated, murderous rage. And that's literally what Miles reflects on, right? That it's just madness and slaughter, and there's no bargaining or reasoning with it. Now remember, because this is Cletus Kasady with what's technically the Extrembiote symbiote, meaning the symbiote that was created by Iron Man, that in effect, it's not truly Carnage, but the principle remains the same, right? The core of Carnage's insanity was Cletus Kasady. And so of course, Miles Morales leaps into action exactly the way you think he would. Now remember, in the last video that we covered, and you'll find a link to that below the like button here on YouTube, that Miles showed up to this diner where Cletus Kasady had basically massacred 60 people in 5 minutes. But when Miles gets there, the whole place is fine, and there are just people who were going about doing their thing, eating their food, and so it seems a little strange to him when suddenly Cletus comes out of nowhere, and that's when Miles realizes the whole thing is an illusion. Lest we forget, the Extrembiote symbiote that Cletus is able to utilize, he can basically extrapolate it out to anything he wants it to be. So what he did is he fabricated this entire environment. Miles was walking into a trap and had no idea it was happening. When the trap sprung, all bets are off. Enter Matt Gargan, the Scorpion. Weird, right? So the Scorpion is one of these weird characters in Marvel Comics where sometimes he's a good guy, sometimes he's a bad guy. When he became Venom in Marvel Comics, that was cool. Superior Spider-Man punched his jaw off his face, and then basically Doc realized that Spider-Man was pulling his punches the whole time. But the thing about this is that Scorpion leaps in and actually helps out Spider-Man in this fight against Cletus. So much so that had that not happened, Miles would have died, because Miles does not have the wherewithal that Peter Parker has. He hasn't faced off against these guys, so he doesn't exactly know what to expect. Now, of course, the one time shows up, right, the cops, they show up here, and they try to bring some order to the chaos. Cletus Kasady helps all these guys finish with all their living, and Matt Gargan finally makes his move. Now, one of the things to know is that, sure, the Scorpion being here is able to help Miles, but it's not enough to, like, turn the tide of battle. It's not enough to make it so that Miles is guaranteed to win. If anything, it allows Miles to basically get out of there while he can. Now, Scorpion ends up retreating as well, but this leads to Miles asking the question, why did you even help me out in the first place, right? Like, why are you here assisting me? And the reality of Scorpion is, like, I kind of owed a favor, right? And that's basically it, right? He's kind of here to a degree as a favor for Miles. Now, it is bigger than that, and we'll find out how much bigger this is here in a little bit. But what ends up happening is, of course, Carnage makes the return, the fight kind of picks up again, not a whole lot doing here, but one of the big things that happens is Miles hits Cletus Kasady with the Venom Blast, and that's enough to kickstart the arc reactor and send Cletus Kasady running. Now, let's explain this for a second. Why does Cletus Kasady have an arc reactor? Rob, that's Iron Man tech, right? Yes, because remember, the Extrembiote armor that Cletus Kasady has was created by Iron Man, and it was powered by an arc reactor. Cletus doesn't fully understand what that means, but with Miles having his electric Venom Blast, it does overload it. Now, what seems to be going on here is that Cletus Kasady seems to be immune to the traditional weaknesses of a symbiote, which is fire, but not enough of the arc reactor blast, right? When this thing goes off, it literally explodes, takes out like a whole city block, and it forces Cletus Kasady to retreat. Now, while Miles Morales and Matt Gargan are kind of digging themselves themselves out of the rubble and trying to find survivors where they can, when they can, and then of course finding some way to get back to Cletus Kasady, you switch over to the introduction of Agent Gao. Now, it's not really the first time we've seen her, it's more of a return of her character. She's not overly important here. She works for a guy named Mr. Hang, who was at one point an X-Men villain, still kind of is to a degree. Those two aren't super important. What is important is the anti-vigilante task force that Agent Gao leads, and the Sentinels that Mr. Hang has that he's going to bring in later on here in a little bit. But the thing about the anti-vigilante task force is you basically have like Electro, at least Maxine, so like the female version of Electro now, alongside Taskmaster, and then Hightail, who can just run at super speed. But the purpose of this group is to, one part, hold superheroes and supervillains accountable, and then offers some kind of a role that's similar to like damage control, but not exactly. The big thing here is that these guys jump in. Not only that, Matt Gargan is more or less part of this, and that's why he's here. But something to understand is that where Cletus Kasady was forced to retreat, initially, he didn't really care about Miles Morales. If anything, attacking and killing Miles would draw a whole bunch of attention to everything he's doing, which is really what he was looking for, right? Putting on an audience and showing the world how dangerous he can become. Now that Miles was able to get the upper hand, it's become a personal vendetta. It's become a desire by Cletus to go directly after Miles. But before he can do any of that, he's got to figure out what he's going to do with the arc reactor in his chest that needs some measure of repair. And so what he ends up doing is basically going to a Tony Stark black site. Now, one of the things to understand about Iron Man is Iron Man has all kinds of different suits. He's got all kinds of different technology, arms and armament, so on and so forth. But these are all scattered at different places throughout the world. One, because New York is a major hub for just terrible things happening, right? Like every time you've seen a massive event happen in Marvel, New York's always the first place they go after. And two, who knows how things would progress? A good example is Age of Ultron, right? So the world can collapse very easily. Having different arms and technologies spread across the world is the safest bet for making sure that you always have redundancies, backups, in case things go south. Cletus showing up here is just one of these sites. Now, what ends up happening is he takes one of the guys out, then he tells another guy named Pete that he basically needs to have this arc reactor technology sorted out. He doesn't fully understand it, but what he does say is, put me in one of those Iron Man Sentinels. Now, this is kind of like a side project that Tony Stark was working on, but it was built on the technology that was partially developed by Mr. Hing. Again, we'll talk more about that here in a little bit. But the reality here is these guys don't fully know how to handle the arc reactor technology because that information isn't shared, right? It's not as though Tony Stark is sending this technology out to his staff, showing them the ins and outs of how his most prized possession functions. It doesn't work that way. So while they're all exceedingly intelligent, the best they can do is try to find some way to fix this technology, or at the very least, up the abilities of Carnage for the purpose of allowing him to operate within this Sentinel. There are some measures of restraint, right? They're not granting him full access to everything, and they're only doing this because their lives are on the line. But one of the other things that happens is really kind of weird, is that basically Cletus Kasady ends up giving Kenneth Neely a portion of his symbiote. Again, Kenneth Neely was just like a fanboy, right? This guy's like simping all over Carnage and Cletus Kasady, bit off more than he can chew, and he's effectively regretting his decisions ever since. But the big point about this is that you end up having the task force that shows up here and faces off against Cletus Kasady yet again. But these guys are overcome with a quickness. Taskmaster actually seems to stand a pretty solid chance despite having no powers other than the ability to mimic the fighting style of anybody he faces off against. The best chance for hope here, even with the intervention of Miles Morales and Matt Gargan showing up in the midst of this conflict, actually comes down to Maxine. It comes down to the new Electro, because having the ability to manipulate electricity, and then while it's not necessarily enough to destroy Cletus Kasady, it is certainly enough to send him running away, or at least to shut down the Sentinel that he's bonded to. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter and it doesn't make any difference. The reason for this is that while the ability for Carnage to access the entirety of the world was effectively limited, it did not stop him from being able to access all of the Stark redundancies, right? They're kind of neural connections that exist out there, right? So like, imagine the internet, except only Tony Stark is able to access it, and it doesn't tie into the main internet as a whole. But what this does is it allows Cletus Kasady to tap into the entirety of the Stark network. It's not that dissimilar from what you saw Ultron do in the Age of Ultron movie, except it is not the internet, it's just Stark's own sort of networking system. But it's close enough, because one of the things to remember here is that Tony Stark bought Parker Industries. Why does that matter? Because in the aftermath of Secret Wars 2015, Peter Parker ran Parker Industries. It was a multinational, multi-billion-dollar company. It made him richer than Tony Stark. They sold all kinds of devices, phones, laptops, the whole 9 yards. It all ended up going defunct. Tony Stark bought the remains, and because it's part of the Stark system, people are still using these phones. Now Cletus Kasady has the ability to tap into all of them. And in effect, he can basically create his own kind of virus, so to speak, and create an army of Cletus Kasadys, which is exactly what he's doing. But what this does is it actually switches over to Normie Osborn. So for those of you guys who are not familiar with Normie Osborn, he of course is related to Norman Osborn, the Green Goblin. He's actually his grandson. They're not exactly alike. And in fact, in the Venom stories, Normie was given his own symbiote by the son of Eddie Brock, Dylan Brock. So in effect, Normie Osborn is the Red Goblin. He's like a Green Goblin, but red, and he's basically a good guy. He functions throughout the city of New York trying to help people where he can, when he can. But the kicker about this is that with the younger brother of Normie answering the phone and then Cletus Kasady being the one to call, and then in turn using his own powers to kind of ensnare the son, this leads to Normie getting involved, realizing something bigger's going on here. And so what you end up getting is the Red Goblin teaming up alongside Miles Morales and the Scorpion, as well as the Vigilante Task Force, all for the purpose of going after Cletus Kasady. Now, there's two things that I want to specify here. Number one, again, this is not Carnage. If it was, this fight would have been over before it even started. And number two, a lot of you guys are probably asking, where's Iron Man in the midst of all of this? Seemingly, Iron Man's just not really involved in this because this kind of thing's just not overly important to him, right? It's kind of below him in terms of the stuff that he concerns himself with. But the thing about this is that with Cletus Kasady tapping into all these phones, laptops, the whole 9 yards, this allows him to ensnare basically everyone. So the entirety of the city of New York descends into absolute madness. This leads to Mr. Hang bringing his Sentinels into the equation for the purpose of one, taking down Cletus Kasady, and then two, actually disseminating a virus out there or a kind of cure that will basically alleviate everybody of all these issues that they're dealing with regards to the influence of Cletus Kasady. But the first thing that has to be done is to sever Cletus from this larger network, right? To remove his ability to tap into phones and all that kind of stuff, and to keep him from being able to access people themselves. Now, one of the funny things about this is that for Red Goblin and Miles, while all this madness is going on, they're initially focusing on Kenneth. Again, Kenneth is not overly important to all of this, but he does have a portion of the Cletus Kasady symbiote. And so Miles initially tries to pull it off of him, right? Like literally Kenneth jumpstarts his own boot jets and then goes to try to fly away. And Miles is like holding on to the symbiote, hoping it'll like rip off of Kenneth as Kenneth just takes off, but it doesn't happen. This is when Red Goblin steps in. So one of the powers that the Red Goblin has, in addition to his traditional symbiote powers, is the ability to absorb other symbiotes. And so he literally takes this symbiote from Kenneth and absorbs it into himself. He becomes a Carnage Red Goblin hybrid. It's pretty dope because one, his look changes, right? Like literally the physical appearance changes and it looks pretty awesome. But two, lest we forget, whenever a person is bonded to a symbiote, they will inevitably take on the attributes of that symbiote. In this case of Normie, it's only a matter of time before he starts to succumb to madness if he's not able to get rid of that symbiote. The other part of this is that if he is able to keep it and he is able to control it, it'll make him one of the most powerful symbiote beings out there in Marvel Comics. This kid's power will basically be next level. And so with Kenneth nearly defeated and then handed over to the cops and just kind of whisked away to a mental asylum in the midst of all of this, now the only real major threat is Cletus. That's when the Sentinels come into play. Now, because they're dealing with Cletus Kasady himself, it allows like Miles and Scorpion and the Anti-Vigilante Task Force to really focus more on the individual people, trying to keep them from hurting themselves and keep them from hurting others. And so while they're doing more like damage control than anything else, for the Sentinels, it doesn't quite work out the way that Mr. Hang initially thought that they would. That because the Sentinels are based on Stark tech, but also just ridiculously advanced forms of technology, right? Like metal plating and all the kind of stuff that goes with it, some adamantium and vibranium thrown in there for good measure, that they are immediately eradicated, or at least one of them is totally destroyed by Cletus Kasady. That shouldn't be able to happen. But remember, the symbiote that Cletus has descends directly from Null, the symbiote god. It's not like Venom, and it's not like Carnage, where it's like a secondary symbiote that was given to him by somebody else. It's way more powerful than symbiotes traditionally are in Marvel. That's one of the things to remember. There's a kind of hierarchy when it comes to the power that a symbiote has. You have like the King in Black, which was at one point Null, the symbiote god. Now it's Eddie Brock Venom. That's happening in the Venom stories. Make sure you guys check out the link below the like button. We'll have that posted as well. But this hierarchy starts with the King in Black, and then it starts going down the line through various symbiotes. Which order that takes depends on how the stories are being written, so it's not an absolute hierarchy, but like the traditional Venom symbiote is pretty high up. Then the Venom symbiote gave birth to the Carnage symbiote, which is one of the reasons why the Carnage symbiote is so incredibly powerful. Enhanced levels of durability, speed, shape-shifting, things along those lines. And so what you're talking about here with regards to the symbiote that Cletus Kasady has is it's second to the King in Black, meaning it's just under the level of power that Null previously had and that Eddie Brock has right now. But the kicker here is that even though one of the Sentinels are destroyed, that the other Sentinel is able to remain operable just long enough to infect Cletus Kasady and shut down his access to all these different internet-based devices using Stark's back doors. And so this basically confines Cletus back to being his normal self, or at least his symbiote self, and all these different human beings go back to being normal. The result here is that symbiote's destroyed, and Miles Morales, Matt Gargan, and Red Goblin have to flee for their life. Now, remember when I told you that this whole conflict was beyond Tony Stark? I kinda lied, because what we do is we transition over to Iron Man, because he's watching all of this unfold, and he realizes what's going on is Cletus Kasady has hijacked his own network. This Cletus Kasady is using Stark tech, and Cletus Kasady is attacking the entire city of New York. So the question that has to be asked here is, what happens to Cletus Kasady when the man who controls the very symbiote that he uses shows up in this conflict? With that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this to an end. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.